I'd like to introduce Pearl Berman, our first presenter. She is a full professor of psychology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. She is the immediate past president of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence Across the Lifespan. A licensed clinical psychologist, she has provided treatment for the negative impact of child abuse, neglect, and family violence. Her research studies of the impact of childhood adversity on adult experiences with violence. She is the second author of NPIV's National Plan to End Interpersonal Violence in 3 Generations. She's also a member of the Academy on Violence and Abuse, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and the American Psychological Association. She served on the National Committee to Prevent Elder Abuse and received the 2019 Rosalie S. Wolfe Memorial Elder Abuse Prevention Award. She collaborated with the Zero Abuse Project to create child and adult advocacy studies, which covers violence across the lifespan. And she received the 2020 Child Advocacy Studies Award. Professor Berman.
Welcome. This webinar is going to provide you with an example of how different forms of violence may be related to each other across the lifespan. This helps illustrate why we cannot forget the past. There are common risk factors in development that can result in many forms of interpersonal violence. Then we will discuss the impact interpersonal violence has on the individual victim, as well as their families, friends, and communities. Next will be a public health approach to healing toxic stress and trauma. We will end with a discussion of action steps that need to be taken to address interpersonal violence. They just wanted to take a walk. A mixed-race couple recently bought their first home and moved into a new neighborhood in an urban area. As they're walking their dog to a nearby park, they suddenly hear loud arguing, followed by gunfire. Moments later, they come across an injured stranger bleeding on the sidewalk. One member of the couple wanted to call for help. The other wanted to avoid getting involved. Why did this happen? Why doesn't each member of the couple have the same opinion about what to do? What do you think should happen next? We are presenting you with this scenario for you to think about these questions and put anything you have in the chat. And as the webinar unfolds, we will be discussing the scenario thoroughly and helping you to answer your questions about interpersonal violence. We have many social problems today that cause us concern. The 3 on this screen, which may seem very different from each other, have in common the great human loss to society, the unfathomable amount of money they cost, and common risk factors from childhood. I will be providing you with some background on these childhood risk factors. I will then use a case history to make it come alive for you, how addressing these adverse childhood experiences could have a powerful impact on reducing many forms of interpersonal violence. Growing up with abuse is a guided apprenticeship in how to be abusive and tolerate being abused. Our understanding of the impact of this childhood tutorial comes from the seminal and continuing work of Drs. Felitti, Anda, Nornberg, and others that began in 1998, and that brought our attention to how the adverse childhood experiences growing up, such as the one that you see on this screen, turned out to be the most significant predictors of adult physical and psychological health. National studies show that about 1/3 of us have had no adverse childhood experiences. 2/3 have 1 or more, and there are 11% of us who have experienced 5 or more. Research has shown that as the adverse childhood experiences we have in our past increases, the greater the likelihood that as teens, we'll become involved in early sexual behavior, abuse of drugs and alcohol, dropping out of school, and involvement in the criminal justice system. The more ACEs in our childhood, the greater the likelihood that as adults, we will have developed drug and alcohol problems, that we may experience depression and anxiety and other mental health problems, that we may develop diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. Dr. Felidi's group created this pyramid to illustrate how the early childhood experiences can lead to the increased likelihood of a lifetime of adversity. Our brains and our bodies are flexible, and they adapt and grow based on our experiences. Toxic stress in childhood leads to increased hormones flooding the brain. The longer this happens, the more likely it can lead to a brain where anger or fear and impulsive behavior are in more control of our decision-making than carefully thinking things through and considering present and future consequences. The more impulsive, angry, or fearful child is less able to develop healthy social relationships with peers and may become isolated or involved in more antisocial groups. This increases the likelihood of involvement in risky behavior, such as early sex, drug and alcohol abuse, dropping out of school. As adults, they have poorer social skills and more employment stresses, all of which are related to disease, disabilities, and emotional problems. Comprehensively addressing child adversity could stop this negative trajectory. Our past doesn't have to define our future, but we can't expect children to get themselves off this trajectory. I will use the lives of Katie and Johnny, a case composite that I created based on my past clinical experiences, to illustrate how the environment they were growing up in, rural poverty, in addition to its direct impact on their parents' ability to provide food, clothing, and shelter, had indirect effects, including attending schools that were supported by low property taxes, living in deteriorating housing, having underfunded social services with large catchment areas in their area, having an unreliable car, having trouble having enough money to put gas in the tank so they could get to any recommended services. Katie and Johnny were also born into families where the parents had poor relationship skills and poor caregiving skills. From birth, they were both victims of abuse and neglect and grew up in an environment where there was violence and alcohol abuse as constants in their parents' lives. Thus, the toxic stress was ongoing in their lives and affected their developing brains. The kindergarten teacher was the first to report Katie to Child Protective Services after noticing visible bruising on her neck and arms. Johnny's abuse was not noticed, but his aggression was, and he was repeatedly punished in class or sent to the principal's office. However, in the first grade, Johnny ended up in the nurse's office after a physical fight with another youngster, and she sent in the first abuse report on Johnny. Child Protective Services did have the money to assess and recommend action to the parents. However, they didn't have enough money to do follow-up, and so the only outcome to the reports were that Katie and Johnny got beatings at home for bringing trouble to the family. If Child Protective Services had been able to ensure that parenting practices actually increased at home, Katie and Johnny might have been able to concentrate in school and see that there were adults in the world who did care about them. Instead, Katie became more depressed, anxious, and withdrawn. Johnny became more angry, hostile, and aggressive. It is important to note that not all the Katies and Johnnies will develop into high-risk adults. They are just more likely to than children with lower adverse childhood events. Some of our high-risk children do receive adequate help from adults and learn how to lead violence-free lives as adults. In Pennsylvania, statistics from 2020 show that adults indicate 37% of them were emotionally abused. 28% came from divorced families, and 26% were physically abused. And it's important to note that these are self-reports. The amount of reports to Child Protective Services is much lower than this. Katie had barely noticed the two boys hovering near the girls' bathroom when she went in. They were boys with bad reputations in school. She had been bullied since kindergarten, and so she was a school isolate. Thus, she left the bathroom alone. This made her seem like a good target for the two boys. One grabbed her and threw her hard onto the ground, held her there while the other began pulling her pants off. At this moment, Johnny came out of the boys' restroom. In an instant, he did think about walking away, but his eyes caught Katie's, and he stepped in swinging hard. In that instant, Katie and Johnny became constant companions at school. Most sexual assault is solo assault and is perpetuated by males, but group assault is more common in teenage males. There are females who commit acts of sexual assault, but they are a much rarer event. About a quarter of all of our sexual offenders are minors, and about a quarter of our victims are under the age of 12. Any youth who crosses the path of someone who doesn't have control of their violence and sexual impulses can become a victim of sexual assault. This person is just in the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, a teen who missed the bus had to walk home in the dark and cross the path of a perpetrator. However, someone with many adverse childhood experiences, like Katie, may be less able to recognize signs that they are in an unsafe situation or around an unsafe person. Neither Katie nor Johnny reported the sexual assault. This is not unusual, which is why in Pennsylvania, we now have a Safe to Say Something crisis center. The center receives anonymous tips from anyone within the school or community. The center then sends information to the relevant school and indicates which students might be in danger of suicide, self-harm, being bullied, etc. At this time, 35% of the tips relate to suicide, 22% to self-harm, and 21% to bullying. This information is just the tip of the iceberg, as most students and staff don't recognize the warning signs of destructive behavior. It's valuable to know who the victims might be and who the perpetrators might be within a school when selecting how to respond. But we need to recognize that violence and other forms of antisocial and destructive behavior are warning signs that a child or youth is being victimized and needs help, despite not asking for it. The past cannot be forgotten in addressing the current problems. The Johnnies in life, caught harming someone in school or on the streets, need help, as well as the Katies. Katie and Johnny were bullied starting in kindergarten. How common is this in Pennsylvania? The Anonymous Pays Youth Survey in 2019 showed that 1/4 of our students were bullied in the past year. 54% said adults took action. And that's great, but then we still have almost half not taking action. Bullying was usually happening on school property. Of those bullied, about a quarter received a physical injury, and about 2/3 were emotionally abused with insults and name calling. In terms of internet safety, about 21% of our students have received inappropriate sexual contact using technology. Not all victims of bullying have high adversity scores, but the Katies and Johnnies have increased risk for being bullied, being the bully, or both. The most common reasons for being victimized were something to do with the way they looked. It could be something changeable, like hairstyle or clothing. It could be something not so easy to change, like their weight, something impossible to change, like their race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. We want our schools to be safe places, but we know that violence is occurring on school property. We can't forget the recent mass shooting in Texas. We can't forget the past when looking at what's happening now. The best predictor of future experiences with violence is having past experiences. In high school, Johnny began hanging out with the same students who were selling drugs at school, as they were the best social fit for him. He was sometimes the muscle for them and was given drugs as payment. Sometimes the pain in their experiences at home were eased when they were high. Their parents had always been role models for the abuse of alcohol. Getting high together was easier than talking together. While together, they didn't feel isolated and alone. Anyone who's looking for excitement and is encouraged by their peer group may experiment with drugs and alcohol. Surveys show that starting in the 6th grade and accelerating with each grade level, youth are being offered alcohol or drugs while at school, making it easier for youth to make an impulsive and serious mistake, especially those with high adversity scores. There were many times growing up that Katie wondered if she'd be better off dead. Johnny was her best friend, and he did protect her from bullying and harassment at school. However, he also took his frustration and rage out against her. In Pennsylvania, we collect self-harm data per 100,000. On the screen, you see examples of Allegheny County, Dauphin County, and Philadelphia, which are the biggest cities in Pennsylvania. And currently, Allegheny County has our highest rate of suicide at 13.5 people per 100,000. People often ask why Katie doesn't leave Johnny. After all, she's feeling suicidal. Rather than separating, Johnny and Katie got married right out of high school. The child abuse ended when they moved out of their parents' homes, but intimate partner violence, which had started in their dating years, continued. Johnny had started out rescuing Katie from sexual assault. He understood they were both victims of child abuse and that they were both still being harmed. Yet now he is the one harming her. Why did their problems continue even after they were freed from their violent parents? Remember the pyramid. They grew up with toxic stress. They lived in an impoverished environment with less help accessible due to low property taxes, large distances, and income inequality. Their parents couldn't teach them skills they didn't know. They did teach them alcohol abuse can be used to decompress at the end of a hard day, and that people do hit each other to solve their problems. Katie's attachment to Johnny was built on her prior isolation and loneliness before meeting him. Her past history of violence made his violence against her seem normal, and his history of saving her from a traumatic sexual assault and constant bullying in school made her feel loyalty to him. While Johnny emotionally and physically abused Katie, she was still his best relationship and her best relationship. Sometimes they listened to each other. Katie would talk about her flashbacks the night her father almost killed her mother. Katie listened to Johnny's stories of being beaten by his father, no matter how hard he tried to get as much work as possible done on the farm, and how angry he was for being helpless. They had a dangerous relationship, but they were each other's best friend. When we try to understand why people don't leave a violent partner or love a parent who's harmed them, we often forget that relationships are complex. In addition, some victims are threatened with death if they try to leave, or having their children taken from them. A final factor we need to consider is that past violence against Katie and against Johnny may have impacted their brains physically. Many victims and perpetrators are found to have significant head injuries that make it more difficult for them to control their current impulses and make good decisions. The past violence can't be forgotten in going to today's solution. Does violence and destructive behavior ever stop? Johnny continued his physical abuse of Katie until after driving drunk on his 69th birthday, he ended up in a wheelchair and needed her constant help. However, he still tried to control her using threats of violence and emotional abuse. Sometimes she did as he told her, but now, sometimes she began to hit him back and threatened to push him down the stairs into the basement. He had no real friends to reach out to. 3 of their 4 children had run away from home as teenagers, never to return. Their youngest, Bill, had entered the military and then did return home. However, Bill didn't hesitate to use violence against either of his parents if they irritated him. He also didn't hesitate to demand money Katie and Johnny could ill afford. Again, he used violence if he needed to get this money. Elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation doesn't always occur due to adult children who were abused becoming abusive and exploitive caretakers of their now older adult parents. However, if an older adult is harmed or exploited, the most likely perpetrator is a relative. Across the lifespan, this is a painful fact that those most likely to harm us may be those closest to us. Bill had left school. He was earning a good living. He'd learned skills in the military, but he didn't learn the social and problem-solving skills that could help him overcome his abusive past and learn to live a nonviolent lifestyle. Bill's pathway to becoming a violent adult is an example of how the intergenerational transmission of violence occurs. Studies done in our prisons show that across white, Black, and Latino offenders, our incarcerated population have very high child adversity scores. We need to address this if we are to end future acts of violence. Some populations are more vulnerable across the lifespan, even without childhood adversity. Are you different in any way? People who are born with or who develop challenges are at much increased risk of violent crime, and they're 2 times more likely to be a victim of sexual assault. The more challenges a person has, the even higher rates of victimization are likely to have occurred. It can be difficult for someone with trouble talking clearly to make a report that authorities find credible. It can also be difficult for someone who can't get by without physical help with toileting, dressing, and eating to report someone who's stealing from them because they fear losing this critically needed help. Today, there's much more accurate available information about what it means to be LGBTQ+ than there used to be. However, it is still not uncommon for these youth to experience violence at the hands of their parents and when adults from their life partner. On surveys, 56% of this population admitted to considering suicide. 61% admitted to constant discrimination. And as a result, 73% are experiencing a mental health challenge. Anyone who is considered different, such as a new immigrant, someone with cognitive difficulties, is at increased risk of violence. In conclusion, while each type of interpersonal violence brings with it some unique aspects, the common precursors to most forms of violence across the lifespan are childhood experiences with violence or serious family dysfunction. Exposure to violence is our best predictor of future violence. This is because early exposure to violence leads to a cascading set of negative impacts on the person's development. Remember the pyramid. Many forms of interpersonal violence are interrelated across the lifespan. Johnny started as a victim of child abuse, but when bullied at school, he became the perpetrator of peer assault, dating violence, intimate partner violence as an adult, and physical child abuse when he became a parent. Katie was a victim throughout her life. Her alcohol abuse led her to be a neglectful parent until she became more powerful than Johnny as an older adult, where she began to respond to her son the way she wanted to and began to perpetrate violence against Johnny. To effectively impact violence, we need to remember that we must help those who are being harmed as well as those who did the harming.